The Great Hall of Elithara Prime was the largest structure ever built by living hands. Its ceiling stretched so high that clouds formed beneath it, and its walls were carved from the bones of a dead moon. 4,000 species had gathered here across the ages to speak, to trade, to make war and peace. Every voice that mattered in the galaxy had echoed through this chamber at one time or another. And today, for the first time, a human stood at the speaking platform. Ambassador Lena Vasquez adjusted the collar of her uniform and looked out across the sea of alien faces. Some had too many eyes. Some had none at all. Some floated in gravity bubbles, and others sat in pools of strange liquid. She had studied every species file Earth had on record, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer weight of their attention or the lack of it. Most of the delegates were not even looking at her. They were talking among themselves, their translators buzzing with dozens of overlapping languages. A few glanced her way with expressions she had learned to recognize as amusement. The Valith delegation, tall, scaled beings with jaws wide enough to swallow a human whole, watched her the way a cat watches a bug crawling across the floor. "The Galactic Concord recognizes the delegation from Earth," the speaker announced. Its voice was calm and mechanical. "Species classification, Tier 9 nascent. You may present your petition." Tier 9, the lowest rank a spacefaring civilization could hold. It meant humanity was considered barely worth noticing, too young, too weak, too small. Their territory was a handful of star systems on the galaxy's outer edge. Their ships were slow. Their weapons were crude. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel 40 years ago. In a galaxy where some empires were older than Earth's sun, humanity was a newborn crawling on the floor. Vasquez stepped forward and spoke clearly. "On behalf of the United Terran government, I petition the Concord for expanded colonial rights in the Viridia Expanse. Our population is growing, and we require new worlds too." A sound interrupted her. It was laughter. It came from the Valith section first, a deep rumbling that shook through the hall. Then it spread. The insected Cathari clicked their mandibles in what passed for humor among their kind. The gas giant dwellers pulsed with color. Even the normally silent Orun shifted in their crystal shells, their lights flickering in patterns that meant amusement. The Valith senior delegate, a massive creature named Sarath Kal, rose from his seat. He did not ask for permission to speak. Elder races never did. "The Concord thanks the human delegation for its enthusiasm," he said, his translator turning his growling words into smooth syllables. "But the Viridia Expanse is unclaimed for a reason. It borders Narvosi hunting grounds. Perhaps the humans would prefer a safer region, something closer to their homeworld, where they can continue to develop." More laughter. Vasquez felt it in her chest like a punch. She kept her face still. She had been warned this would happen. Earth's intelligence briefings had made it very clear. Humanity was a joke to the galactic community. Their news networks ran comedy segments about human culture. Their academics wrote papers about whether humans were even truly intelligent or just unusually clever animals. One popular alien entertainment show had a recurring character called the Little Human, who stumbled through space making mistakes. "We are aware of the risks," Vasquez said steadily. "We are prepared to defend our colonies." Sarath Kal's mouth opened wide in what she knew was a Valith smile. "With what?" She did not answer. She simply gave a small nod, gathered her documents, and left the platform. The laughter followed her all the way to the exit. The Cathari delegation did not even turn their heads as she passed. To them, she did not exist. Back in the tiny human embassy, 3 rooms on the station's lowest level, wedged between a waste processing plant and a cargo bay, Vasquez sat alone and stared at the wall. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from anger. Her communicator buzzed. She opened the channel. "How did it go?" The voice belonged to Admiral Konstantin Zheng, speaking from somewhere very far away. His tone was calm, as it always was, but she could hear the edge beneath it. "Exactly as we expected," she said. They laughed. There was a pause. Then Zheng said, "Good, let them." 6,000 light-years from Elithara Prime, in a nebula that had no name on any galactic chart. Admiral Zheng stood on the observation deck of a construction platform and watched the future take shape. The nebula was dark and dense, perfect for hiding things, and humanity had a great deal to hide. Zheng was a tall man, lean and quiet, with gray at his temples and scars on his hands from a lifetime of service. He had fought in the Belt Wars of 2309, commanded the defense of Mars during the Proxima Crisis, and led the first armed expedition beyond human space. He had seen what the galaxy thought of his species. He had read the intelligence reports. He had watched the recordings of alien empires burning through weaker civilizations like fire through dry grass. And he had decided, very quietly, that humanity would never be burned. The project had begun 8 years ago, before humanity even joined the conquered. A small group within the Terran military had looked at the galaxy and seen the truth that the politicians were too polite to say out loud. The universe was not a community. It was a jungle, and in the jungle, you were either a predator or prey. Humanity refused to be either, so they chose to become something else entirely. Project Colossus. Through the observation window, Zheng could see the skeleton of the first ship. It was enormous, so large that the construction drones looked like insects crawling over its frame. 9 kilometers from bow to stern, armored in layers of composite plating that could shrug off weapons that would crack a planet's crust. Armed with systems that the galaxy's elder races had never imagined because they had never needed to. They had grown comfortable in their power. They had stopped innovating. They had stopped being afraid. Humans had never stopped being afraid, and that fear had made them very, very creative. 12 ships, 12 dreadnoughts, each one a fortress, a weapon, and a statement all at once. They were not elegant. They were not beautiful. They were brutal and massive and built for one purpose, to make the galaxy understand that humanity was not a joke. Zheng watched the welding arcs flash in the darkness of the nebula, and thought about Ambassador Vasquez standing alone in that great hall while 4,000 species laughed at her. He opened his communicator and spoke to his chief engineer. "How is the timeline?" "Ahead of schedule, Admiral. The Wrath of Terra will be ready for trials within 18 months. Zheng nodded. "Push it to 12. He closed the channel and looked back out at the ships growing in the dark. Somewhere out there the galaxy was still laughing. That was fine. Zheng was a patient man. He could wait. But one day very soon, the laughter would stop. And what came after would be remembered for a very long time. 3 years passed, and humanity grew. Not fast enough for the politicians, and not quietly enough for the galaxy. New colonies spread across the Viridia expanse like seeds thrown into fertile soil. Mining stations drilled into asteroid belts. Research outposts blinked to life on frozen moons. Families packed their lives into transport ships and crossed the black ocean of space to build homes on worlds that had never known a human footprint. It was a good time, a hopeful time. It did not last. The colony of New Svalbard sat on the edge of human space, a small world of green valleys and cold rivers where 12,000 people had built a life. They had farms and schools and a little hospital with only 2 doctors. The children played in the meadows and looked up at the sky and dreamed of the stars. The stars came to them on a Tuesday morning. The Narvosi arrived without warning. Their ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above the colony and began firing before the colonists even understood what was happening. The Narvosi were raiders, a mid-tier empire that survived by taking what others had built. They were tall, gray-skinned creatures with 4 arms and black eyes that showed no feeling at all. They had been raiding weaker species for centuries. The galaxy knew about it. The conquered knew about it. Nobody did anything, because the Narvosi only targeted species too weak to fight back. Species like humanity. The attack lasted 6 hours. When it was over, New Svalbard was burning. 3,000 people were dead. The rest, men, women, and children, were loaded into slave transports and carried away into Narvosi space. The colony's distress signal, repeated on every channel for 2 days before a passing freighter picked it up and relayed it to Earth. The news hit humanity like a hammer to the chest. Ambassador Vasquez received the report on Elithara Prime and immediately requested an emergency session with the Galactic Concord. She stood at the same platform where she had been laughed at 3 years ago and presented the evidence, footage from the colony's security systems, the distress recordings, the slave transport signatures. She asked the Concord to condemn the Narvosi and authorize a rescue mission. The chamber was quiet this time, not out of respect but out of discomfort. The delegates shifted in their seats and avoided her eyes. The speaker processed her request and turned it over to the floor. The Valith delegate, Sarath Kal, spoke first. "The Concord sympathizes with Earth's loss," he said, in a tone that held no sympathy at all. "However, the Narvosi Confederacy operates within its recognized sphere of influence. Frontier conflicts between unequal powers are natural. Tier 9 species must learn to protect their borders or accept the consequences of expansion beyond their means." Vasquez stared at him. "You are telling me that 12,000 of my people enslaved, murdered, is a natural consequence?" "I am telling you," Sarath Kal replied, "that the galaxy does not owe protection to those who cannot protect themselves." The chamber murmured in agreement. The Cathari said nothing. The vote to intervene failed before it even began. The session moved on to trade disputes. Vasquez walked out of the chamber for the second time with the sound of indifference ringing in her ears. But this time she was not shaking with anger. She was cold. Perfectly, terribly cold. She returned to the human embassy and sat down at her secure terminal. She typed a single word into an encrypted channel that bounced through 17 relay stations before reaching a nameless nebula on the far side of mapped space. The word was Colossus. 6,000 light-years away, Admiral Konstantin Zheng read the message and closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When he opened them, they were hard as stone. He walked to the command center of the construction platform and looked at the screens that showed the status of every ship in the program. All 12 dreadnoughts were complete. They had been for months. He had been waiting, hoping, perhaps, that this moment would never come, that the galaxy would prove him wrong, that someone out there would show basic decency. Nobody had. Zheng activated the fleet-wide communication system. His voice reached every ship, every crew member, every officer in the program. "This is Admiral Zheng. Colossus is active. All ships move to combat readiness. All crews report to stations. This is not a drill." He paused, then continued. 3 days ago, the Narvosi Confederacy attacked one of our colonies. They killed our people. They took our people as slaves. We asked the galaxy for help. The galaxy told us to accept it. His voice was steady, but every person listening could feel the iron beneath it. "We do not accept it." He looked down at the tactical display. 12 dreadnoughts, fully armed, fully crewed. Each one carried enough firepower to crack open a small moon. The flagship, the TNS Wrath of Terra, was a monster of engineering, 9 kilometers of armor and weapons and fury made solid. It was the most powerful warship ever built by human hands, and it was not alone. Zheng had spent years developing the fleet's combat doctrine. He called it the doctrine of overkill, and it was simple. Other species built their militaries for balance, enough strength to win, but not so much that it was wasteful. They fought wars of maneuver and negotiation, where fleets danced around each other and battles ended in treaties. Humans did not fight like that. The doctrine of overkill said, "Do not win battles, end them. Use so much force that the enemy does not just lose, they cease to exist as a fighting force. Make the destruction so complete, so total, that every species watching will understand the cost of attacking humanity. Do not leave room for doubt. Do not leave room for a second attempt." It was not elegant. It was not civilized. But civilization had looked at 12,000 enslaved humans and shrugged its shoulders. Zheng briefed his senior officers in the war room of the Wrath of Terra. Captain Ajora Obi of the Dreadnought Iron Resolve, Captain Yuki Tanaka of the Hammer of Saul, Captain James Ape of the final word. 12 captains, 12 ships, and the cold certainty of what they were about to do. Narvosi intelligence suggests they are preparing a second invasion fleet, Zhang told them. They expect to hit our inner colonies within the month. Their warlord, Thalvek, has been boasting publicly. He thinks we are helpless. He brought up a star map. A single route glowed red, the only viable approach vector from Narvosi space into the Viridia expanse. We are not going to wait for them to come to us. We will position the fleet here at the Viridia threshold directly in their path. When they arrive, they will find us waiting. Captain Obi leaned forward, and if the Conquered objects? Zhang looked at her. The Conquered told us to protect ourselves. That is exactly what we are going to do. The fleet moved out that night. 12 dreadnoughts slipped through the nebula and into open space, their drives burning cold to avoid detection. They moved through uncharted routes that no galactic survey had ever mapped, routes that humanity's exploration ships had quietly charted years ago, just in case. No announcements were made. No warnings were sent. The Galactic Conquered did not know the fleet existed. The Narvosi did not know it was coming. The galaxy continued to spin, unaware that everything was about to change. In the darkness between the stars, the Wrath of Terra led its sisters forward, and Admiral Zhang stood on the bridge and watched the void. He thought about New Svalbard. He thought about the children. Then he stopped thinking and started planning. The Narvosi had made their choice. Now humanity would make its own. Warlord Thalvek stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Bone Crown, and looked at the fleet assembling around him with deep satisfaction. 300 warships, cruisers, destroyers, assault carriers, and slave transports, all bearing the jagged markings of the Narvosi Confederacy. It was the largest raiding fleet the Narvosi had assembled in 50 years, and every ship was pointed at one target, the soft, undefended heart of human space. Thalvek was a creature built for war. He stood 8 feet tall, with gray skin stretched over muscle and bone like leather over stone. His 4 arms each bore the ritual scars of 100 raids. His black eyes had watched civilizations crumble, and they had never once looked away. He had studied humanity carefully. He had read their files, examined their fleet strength, analyzed their weapons, and he had concluded what every other species in the galaxy had already decided: humans were weak. Their warships were small and few. Their defenses were thin. Their people were soft creatures of flesh and feeling who broke easily under pressure. New Svalbard had proven it. The humans had screamed and cried and begged. They had not even fought back in any meaningful way. It had been the easiest raid of Thalvek's career. Now he would take everything they had. "Signal the fleet," he ordered. "We jump to the Viridia threshold in 1 hour. From there, we push straight to their core worlds. I want their colonies stripped and their population loaded into transports before they can even send a distress signal." His officers obeyed without question. The Narvosi fleet powered up their drives and prepared to jump. In Thalvek's mind, the campaign was already over. Humanity was simply too small to stop what was coming. He was wrong. Across the galaxy, strange readings had been appearing on long-range sensor arrays for days. Massive energy signatures moving through regions of space that were supposed to be empty. The Cathari Hegemony's intelligence division flagged the readings and passed them up the chain. Their senior analysts looked at the data, decided it was sensor interference from a nearby pulsar, and filed it away. The Valith Dominion's military sensors picked up the same readings. A junior officer recommended investigation. His commander told him not to waste resources on ghost signals from the outer rim and reassigned him to cargo inspection duty. Nobody looked closer. Nobody cared. Whatever was moving out there, it was in human space, and nothing in human space was worth worrying about. The Narvosi fleet made its jump. 300 warships tore through the fabric of space and emerged at the Viridia threshold, a wide stretch of open space that served as the natural gateway into the human colonial zone. It was the only viable approach route, and Thalvik had chosen it because it was direct and fast. For exactly 2 seconds after the jump, everything seemed normal. Stars in every direction, empty space, the quiet hum of ships settling after faster-than-light travel. Then the sensors screamed. Every screen on every ship in the Narvosi fleet lit up with contacts. Not a few, not dozens. Thousands of individual signatures arranged in a perfect crescent formation directly across their path, close enough that the Narvosi fleet had dropped out of FTL practically on top of them. Thalvik stared at his display and felt something he had not felt in decades: confusion. 12 ships sat at the center of the formation, but the word ships did not do them justice. They were mountains of metal and armor, each one larger than anything the Narvosi had ever built or even imagined. The smallest was over 5 kilometers long. The largest, the one sitting directly at the center, its hull bristling with weapon arrays that glowed with charged energy, was 9 kilometers from bow to stern. Around the dreadnoughts, hundreds of smaller escort ships held formation. Frigates, corvettes, and carrier groups, all painted in the dark gray of the United Terran Navy. The humans had been waiting for them. They had known the route. They had known the timing. They had been sitting here in the dark, silent and patient, like a predator crouched beside a trail. Thalvik opened his mouth to give an order, but he never got the chance. The Wrath of Terra fired first. A sound not truly a sound, since space carried no sound, but the ship's hull vibrated with the force of it, rolled through the Narvosi fleet as the Dreadnought's main weapons activated. Massive electromagnetic rails running the length of the ship's spine hurled kinetic projectiles, the size of buildings at speeds that defied belief. Each round hit with the force of a nuclear weapon, punching through Narvosi shields as if they were not there, and tearing ships apart from the inside out. The other 11 dreadnoughts fired at the same moment. Directed plasma lances, beams of superheated matter focused into cutting lines of white fire, swept across the Narvosi formation like blades through grass. Shields that were designed to withstand conventional weapons simply evaporated. Hull plating melted. Reactors breached. Ships died in bright, silent explosions that lit up the darkness. And then came the drones. Every dreadnought carried millions of them, small, autonomous combat machines no bigger than a human fist, each one armed with cutting lasers and magnetic clamps. They launched in clouds so dense they looked like dark storms pouring from the sides of the Terran ships. The swarms crossed the gap between the fleets in seconds and descended on the Narvosi vessels like locusts on a field. They cut through hull plating, severed power conduits, destroyed sensor arrays, and burrowed into engine housings. Ships that survived the initial barrage found themselves being eaten alive by machines too small and too numerous to fight. Thalvik watched his fleet die. It happened so fast that his mind could not keep up with what his eyes were showing him. Ships that had served the Confederacy for decades vanished in flashes of light. His cruisers, his destroyers, his assault carriers, all of them breaking apart, burning, spinning into the void as lifeless wreckage. The slave transports, the ones he had brought to carry millions of humans back to Narvosi space, were among the first to die. The Terran gunners had targeted them specifically. In 20 minutes, half the Narvosi fleet was gone. In 30 minutes, 2/3. At the 40-minute mark, every Narvosi ship that could still move was trying to run, their drives burning at maximum as they fled in every direction. The Terran escorts ran them down with methodical precision, cutting off escape routes and herding the survivors into kill zones where the dreadnoughts could finish them. The Bone Crown took a direct hit from a plasma lance that melted its port side and killed a third of its crew. The ship listed, its drives flickering, its weapons offline. Thalvik gripped the railing of his command bridge with all 4 hands and stared at the burning ruins of everything he had built. 300 warships, 40 minutes, gone. Then a communication channel opened on his screen. The face of a human appeared, an older man with gray temples and steady eyes. Admiral Konstantin Zheng. Zheng said nothing. He simply adjusted his camera so that Thalvik could see the view from the bridge of the Wrath of Terra, the vast field of burning wreckage that had once been the greatest Narvosi fleet in half a century, now reduced to drifting metal and cooling plasma. Thalvik stared at the image. Zheng stared at Thalvik. The channel closed. In the silence that followed, Thalvik sank into his command chair. Around him, his surviving officers stood frozen, their black eyes wide, their gray skin pale. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. Across the galaxy, the battle data traveled at the speed of light through relay stations and communication networks. Every species with access to military intelligence received it. The Cathari analysts who had dismissed the sensor readings as interference stared at their screens in shock. The Valith officer who had recommended investigation and been sent to cargo duty stood in a hallway and read the report on his personal device, his scaled face unreadable. On Elithara Prime, the galactic news networks received the data and went silent for a full hour before broadcasting it. When they finally reported it, the anchor's beings who had covered wars and disasters across 1,000 worlds spoke in careful, measured tones, as if they were afraid that speaking too loudly might attract the attention of the species that had just done the impossible. A Tier 9 civilization had destroyed a Tier 5 war fleet in less than an hour, with ships that nobody knew existed, with weapons that nobody had ever seen. The galaxy had been laughing at humanity for years. Nobody was laughing now. The emergency session of the Galactic Concord was called within 12 hours of the battle. It was the first emergency session in 200 years, and every delegation in the galaxy scrambled to attend. The Great Hall of Elithara Prime, which normally held the relaxed buzz of routine politics, was charged with something electric and dangerous. Every seat was filled. Species that normally sent junior representatives had dispatched their most senior leaders. The Valith Dominion's High Chancellor himself had arrived, something that had not happened in living memory. The Cathari Hegemony's Queen Speaker attended in person, carried on a throne of living crystal by her attendants. They were all there for the same reason. They were all afraid. The topic was listed on the official agenda as discussion of recent military activity in the Veridia Expanse. But everyone in the chamber knew what it really meant: the humans. Sarath Kal, the Valith delegate who had laughed at Ambassador Vasquez 3 years ago, opened the session. His tone was very different now. There was no amusement in his voice, no casual dismissal. He spoke with the careful precision of someone choosing every word as if it might be his last. "The Concord faces a situation without precedent," he began. "A species classified as Tier 9, the lowest tier, has deployed military assets that exceed the capabilities of most Tier 3 civilizations. 12 capital ships of a class and power level that should not exist. Weapons systems that no member of this Concord has ever developed or encountered. This is not a minor border skirmish. This is a fundamental shift in the balance of galactic power." He paused and looked directly at the human section of the gallery. "And it was done in complete secrecy, under our noses, while we were watching." The chamber buzzed with anxious murmuring. Thousands of alien voices overlapping, translators struggling to keep up. Fear had a sound, and this was it. Behind the scenes, in the private meeting rooms and secure channels that surrounded the Great Hall, 3 factions had already formed among the elder races. The first was led by the Valith Dominion. Sarath Kal had spent the last 12 hours in furious communication with his government, and their position was clear. Humanity was a threat that needed to be contained before it grew any stronger. The Valith proposed a joint military expedition, a coalition of elder race fleets that would surround human space and force them to surrender their dreadnoughts. They called it a peacekeeping action. Everyone knew what it really was. The second faction was led by the Cathari Hegemony, and their position surprised everyone. The Cathari, the same species that had refused to acknowledge Vasquez's existence 3 years ago, now wanted to make humanity an ally. Their logic was cold and practical. The Dreadnought fleet existed. It could not be unbuilt. Fighting humanity would be costly and uncertain. Better to bring them inside the power structure, give them a higher tier ranking, and keep them close where they could be watched and influenced. The third faction was not really a faction at all. It was simply dozens of mid-tier species who wanted nothing to do with any of it. They had seen the battle data. They had seen what those dreadnoughts could do. They wanted to stay as far from humanity as physically possible. The debate raged for hours. The Valith pushed hard for their punitive expedition. Sareth Kal argued that allowing humanity to keep its fleet would set a dangerous example, that every minor species in the galaxy would start building secret weapons, and the order that had held for millennia would collapse. If we do not act now, he warned, we tell every Tier 7, Tier 8, and Tier 9 species in this Concord that the rules do not matter, that anyone with enough ambition and enough hidden shipyards can challenge the natural order. We cannot allow this. The Cathari Queen Speaker responded with a series of sharp clicks that her translator rendered as ice-cold logic. You propose we send our fleets against a species that destroyed 300 Narvosi warships in 40 minutes. Tell me, Sareth Kal, how many ships are you willing to lose to teach this lesson? Because I am willing to lose none. The vote on the punitive expedition was scheduled for the end of the session. The Valith were confident they had enough support. They had spent hours making deals, offering trade concessions, and applying pressure to smaller delegations. The numbers, they believed, were in their favor. Then Ambassador Lena Vasquez entered the chamber. She walked alone, without guards or aides, wearing the same simple uniform she had worn 3 years ago. Her footsteps echoed in the sudden silence that fell over the great hall. 4,000 delegations turned to watch her approach the speaking platform, the same platform where she had been laughed at, dismissed, and ignored. She was not laughed at now. Vasquez stood at the platform and looked out at the chamber. She took a long, slow breath. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, and it carried to every corner of the hall. 3 years ago, I stood here and asked for your help. You laughed. 1 year ago, I stood here and showed you evidence that our people were being murdered and enslaved. You told us it was our own fault. She paused. We heard you, we understood, and we prepared accordingly. The chamber was absolutely still. I am not here to threaten you. I am not here to apologize. I am here to tell you a simple truth. She looked directly at Sareth Kal. We built 12 dreadnoughts in secret while you laughed at us. We developed weapons you have never seen, using principles you have never explored. We did this in shipyards you did not know existed, using resources you did not know we had, in a region of space you never bothered to survey. She let that settle. Ask yourselves, what else have we built that you do not know about? The silence that followed was the loudest sound the great hall had ever held. Vasquez did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply stood there and let the question do its work. In the minds of every delegate in that chamber, a door opened, a door to a dark room full of possibilities. If humanity could build 12 dreadnoughts in secret, what else was hiding in those unmapped nebulas? More ships, new weapons, things even worse than what they had already seen. The answer was that nobody knew, and that uncertainty was more terrifying than any fleet. The vote on the punitive expedition was called 30 minutes later. It failed. Not by a slim margin, it failed overwhelmingly. Species that had promised the Valith their support changed their votes at the last moment. The mid-tier delegations voted against it as a bloc. Even some of the elder races broke ranks. Sareth Kal sat in his seat and watched the vote tallies appear on his screen, and for the first time in his long life, he had no words. The expedition died because of fear. Not fear of what humanity had shown, fear of what humanity might still be hiding. But while the politicians argued and voted, the Dreadnought fleet was already moving. Admiral Zheng had not waited for the Concord's permission. He did not need it. He did not want it. The fleet crossed into Narvosi space through routes that the Confederacy did not even know existed and arrived at the slave worlds, the planets where the Narvosi kept their captured populations in chains. The Narvosi garrison forces at each world took one look at the approaching dreadnoughts and surrendered without firing a single shot. Some of them simply abandoned their posts and fled into deep space. The ones who stayed dropped their weapons and knelt on the ground with their forearms raised. Human Marines landed on world after world. They broke open slave camps. They cut chains. They carried children out of dark places and into the light. They found humans from New Svalbard, those who had survived, and they found thousands of aliens from dozens of other species, all taken by the Narvosi over the years, all forgotten by the galaxy. They freed everyone, not just the humans, everyone. The freed aliens, beings of every shape and color and kind, watched in shock as human soldiers gave them food, treated their wounds, and helped them send messages to their home worlds. Some of them had been slaves for decades. Some had been born in captivity and had never known freedom. They looked at the humans with eyes that held a question they were afraid to ask. Why? Why would you help us? The answer was simple, and a human medic gave it to a freed Cathari worker, whose wings had been clipped by the Narvosi years ago. Because someone should have done it a long time ago. Those messages, sent from freed slaves to their home worlds, traveled across the galaxy faster than any fleet. They told a story that no amount of political maneuvering could counter. Humanity had not just fought for itself. It had fought for the people the galaxy had abandoned. It had done what the galactic conquered, with all its power and all its wisdom, had refused to do. The laughter was gone. In its place was something new, something that the elder races had not expected and did not know how to handle. Respect. 6 months changed everything. The Galactic Concord's Classification Committee met behind closed doors and did something that had never been done in the history of the institution. They reclassified humanity from Tier 9, the lowest rank, to Tier 2, skipping 7 levels in a single vote. The committee members argued about it for less than an hour. The evidence was too overwhelming to debate. Military power alone would have justified a jump to Tier 4 or Tier 3. But it was not just the dreadnoughts that had changed their minds. It was what humanity had done with them. The freed slave world sent representatives to Elithara Prime, dozens of species, some of them so minor that the conquered had forgotten they existed. They came to speak on humanity's behalf, and their testimony was devastating. They described years of captivity, of suffering, of sending pleas for help to a galaxy that never answered. And they described the day the human ships appeared in their skis, the day the chains were broken and the camps were opened. A Cathari delegate, whose cousin had been among the freed slaves, stood in the Great Hall and said something that would be quoted for centuries. We spent 1,000 years building this conquered and calling ourselves civilized. The humans have been here for less than a decade, and they have shown us what that word actually means. The Tier 2 reclassification passed without opposition. The human embassy on Elithara Prime was moved from its cramped quarters near the waste processing plant to a prime location on the station's upper ring, a sprawling complex with tall windows that looked out over the nebula. Species that had once refused to walk past the human section now requested formal meetings. Ambassador Vasquez's calendar was full for months. She needed a staff of 40 just to handle the incoming diplomatic traffic. The Narvosi Confederacy did not survive the year. Without their fleet, without their slave economy, and without the fear that had held their subject races in line, the Confederacy crumbled from the inside. Species that the Narvosi had conquered and controlled for generations rose up in revolt, inspired by the sight of human Marines breaking open slave camps. The revolt spread from world to world like wildfire, and the Narvosi military, already shattered and demoralized, could not stop them. Warlord Thalvek held on for 3 months, retreating to the Confederacy's capital world and trying to rally what remained of his forces. But his own officers had lost faith. The same commanders who had followed him without question for decades now looked at him and saw the leader who had poked a sleeping giant and brought ruin to everything they had built. They overthrew him on a cold morning. There was no trial. They simply walked into his chambers, disarmed his guards, and put him in chains, the same kind of chains the Narvosi had used on their slaves. Then they loaded him onto a transport and sent him to Elithara Prime, addressed to Ambassador Lena Vasquez, with a note that read, "A gift from the free worlds. Do with him as you see fit." Vasquez looked at Thalvik through the energy barrier of his holding cell. He was smaller than she had imagined. His 4 arms hung at his sides, and his black eyes stared at the floor. The creature who had burned New Svalbard and taken 12,000 humans as slaves now sat in a cell on a station he had once walked through as a conqueror. She said nothing to him. There was nothing to say. She turned the matter over to the Concord's Justice Division and walked away. The ripples spread further. The Valith Dominion, the oldest and proudest of the elder races, the ones who had laughed loudest at humanity's first appearance, sent a private envoy to Admiral Zheng. The meeting took place aboard the Wrath of Terra, in a conference room that overlooked the ship's forward weapons array. The symbolism was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. The Valith envoy was a senior diplomat named Kareth Mal, a creature of impeccable manners and ancient breeding. He had spent 2 centuries negotiating with the galaxy's most powerful species. He had never once lowered his head to anyone. He lowered it to Zheng. "The Dominion seeks a formal non-aggression agreement with the Terran government," Kareth Mal said, his translator rendering his words with unusual care. "We recognize that past interactions between our peoples have been regrettable. We wish to move forward on terms of mutual respect." Zheng sat across from him and studied him for a long time. Then he nodded. "We accept, but the terms will be ours." Kareth Mal hesitated, then bowed his head again. "Agreed." It was a small gesture, but it echoed across the galaxy. The Valith Dominion, a civilization that measured its history in millions of years, had bent its neck to a species that had been in space for less than a century. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been rewritten. A phrase began to circulate through the galaxy's trade routes and communication networks, whispered in bars and meeting rooms and military academies in 100 different languages. Nobody knew who said it first, but it spread like a virus, and once it took hold, it never let go. "Do not wake the humans." It became a warning, a proverb, a piece of common wisdom that every species taught its children. Do not raid their colonies. Do not threaten their people. Do not mistake their kindness for weakness or their patience for submission, because when humanity woke up, it did not fight battles. It ended them. On a quiet evening, 6 months after the battle that changed everything, Ambassador Vasquez and Admiral Zheng met on the observation deck of the Wrath of Terra. The ship was docked at a deep space station, undergoing maintenance. Through the wide windows, the stars stretched out in every direction, cold, bright, and infinite. Vasquez stood beside Zheng and looked out at the view. They had not spoken privately since before the battle, and there was a heaviness between them that came from shared burdens carried over long distances. "Was it worth it?" she asked. Zheng did not answer immediately. He looked at the stars as if he were counting them. "The secrecy," she continued, "the cost, the fear we put into them. Every species in this galaxy looks at us differently now, some with respect, some with terror. We changed what humanity means to the universe, and we can never go back. Was it worth it?" Zheng thought about New Svalbard. He thought about the children loaded into slave transports. He thought about the freed slaves who had looked at human soldiers with disbelief in their eyes, because they had forgotten that anyone could care about them. "They gave us 2 choices," he said finally. "Be prey or be predators. We chose a third option. We became the storm that protects the ones nobody else would protect." Vasquez looked at him, and the fear. "Fear fades," Zheng said. "What we did for those people, that is remembered forever." She nodded slowly and turned back to the stars. Across the galaxy, the changes continued. The freed species of the former Narvosi Confederacy formed a coalition, the Free Worlds Compact, and formally allied themselves with humanity. Other minor species, tired of being ignored and exploited by the elder races, joined them. The alliance grew rapidly, drawing in species that had never had a voice in galactic affairs and giving them protection under the Terran banner. It was called the Terran Protectorate Alliance, and within a year, it was the third largest political body in the galaxy. The Galactic News Network, the same one that had once run comedy segments about humans and called them the galaxy's latest punchline, ran a special broadcast about the formation of the Alliance. The anchor, a being of light and sound who had covered galactic politics for 3 centuries, reported on the growth of human influence with a tone of careful respect. At the end of the broadcast, the anchor paused. It flickered slightly, the equivalent of a human taking a breath, and added a personal comment, something anchors almost never did. When humanity first arrived at Elithara Prime, this network described them as a joke, a small, young species with nothing to offer the galaxy. We were wrong. They were not a joke. They were a warning, and the punchline was on us. The broadcast ended. Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched it and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. And in an unnamed nebula, far from any charted system, in a region of space that no galactic survey had ever reached, construction lights flickered to life. New shipyard platforms powered up their systems. Raw materials moved along transport lines. Engineering crews reported for duty. The Dreadnought fleet had proven what humanity could build, but Zheng had always known that 12 ships were just the beginning. The galaxy was vast, and there were other empires out there, older and darker than the Narvosi, that had not yet tested humanity's resolve. When they did, humanity would be ready. The first hull plates of a new ship class were laid down in silence, deep in the dark where no one was watching. They were bigger than the Dreadnoughts, much bigger. Humanity was not done. The universe had laughed at them once. It had learned its lesson. But humanity had learned something too, that in a galaxy full of ancient powers and forgotten cruelties, sometimes the youngest voice in the room is the one that speaks loudest. And sometimes the punchline bites back.